Thank you so much for being here. I'm very happy that the need to isolate ourselves happened in a time that we have the technology to enhance our ability to, if not be with each other, to at least share with each other. Conversations are sometimes very difficult. Sometimes unpleasant things are said. I remember sitting with a group of men, and someone turned to me and said, "It's always about you, isn't it?" I was hurt, but I thought about it a lot. Is it always about me? In the years since I've heard those words, I've asked myself many times, is it always about me? I found that the thoughts about me increased when I was in my studio. I found that I was really just trying to explain me. So I have the opportunity now to share me. And I hope that you find me worth your time. I'm the youngest sibling in a family of artists. My mother was a singer who directed the church choir in this small steel town of Farrow in western Pennsylvania. She also did local concerts in the region of Ohio and Pennsylvania. My father did not consider himself to be an artist, but he did pride himself on being the best barber among many good barbers. I have 6 siblings who all played musical instruments, and one who mastered the piano. They also painted, sculpted, and fixed almost anything that broke. They were all children of the Great Depression, and they prided themselves on being people who never bought toys. They taught themselves to be creative, and they all made their own toys. Being the youngest, with an 8-year difference between me and the brother next to me, was not easy because they often said I was spoiled. I never learned to play a musical instrument. I never learned to speak with a musical instrument. But at a very early age, I fell in love with photography. When I was about 9 years old, in 1949, I found an old box camera. It probably would not have functioned even if I had put film in it. At that time, I don't even know if I knew what photographic film was. But the camera clicked. And I remember looking in the viewfinder, pressing the shutter, and in my mind, I remembered what I had seen in that little window on the top of the box. I also remember looking at the photographs in the many books that our family always had on hand. I remember looking at the photographs in the local newspaper that was delivered daily. And I remember seeing photographs of men and women and children and animals. And I remember looking for photographs of people who looked like me, black people. In my mid-teens, I remember finding a book in the town library titled The Family of Man. Some 25 years later, as a professional photographer, I visited the library to see if they had photo books for young people in that town. And I saw that book, The Family of Man, on the library shelf. And I looked at the sign-out card that's in the back of the book. I, as a teenager, had signed that book out about 15 times. My multiple signatures were the only signatures on that sign-out card. In that book, this photograph, taken in Botswana by Life magazine photographer Nat Farman, is still locked in my mind. I loved the animation of the African storyteller. I loved the way the children watched and listened. It was a lovely moment that I was seeing, and it was a lovely moment for me to see that photograph. In my early 20s, I found a book by Leo Tolstoy titled What is Art? In it, he wrote about the purpose of art. It, or art, is a means of union among men, joining them together in the same feeling, and indispensable for the life and progress toward well-being of individuals and of humanity. There are 2 photographers that I always try to share when I speak about photography. The first is this image by Roy de Carava, Harlem Hallways. And I saw it in a photographic magazine when I was in the Air Force stationed in France. His use of the subtle gray tones is beautiful. Those subtle silver gray tones are like a combination of blues and ballads. He seems to use tone to communicate beauty and comfort. It might be defined as challenging subject matter. Robert Frank's photographs from his book, The Americans, was in the same photo magazine, and it was a magazine with photographs of recipients of the Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. Robert Frank's compositions and printing style were raw, challenging, and informal. It felt like the independent parts of the content needed to be pulled together by the viewer. The composition itself created energy. His style broke rules. Both photographers seemed to speak to me with different voices. These photographs confirmed for me that photography is an art form. It is an art form that was discovered in the 19th century, and it became important to me to know what life was like in the 19th century. You will all recognize this space as Independence Hall. In the United States, a mid-century painter saw Independence Hall this way. Now imagine walking and living in this world. In the 19th century, there was no typewriter, or as they called it, a typo writer. But now we carry those marvelous little instruments, these little blocks in our pockets. The Trail of Tears had begun, or the Indian Removal Act, which was in full force. Now, that was the act that forcibly removed the American indigenous people from their land to clear that land for mining and habitation by the government and new immigrants. 1861 witnessed the beginning of the Civil War. Chattel slavery was legal, and an American social theorist and judge, George Fitzhugh, argued that the Negro is but a grown-up child. At the same time, there were informal networks of secret routes and safe houses called the Underground Railroad. These routes and safe houses were used by abolitionists to move black and enslaved people to free states and to Canada. On May 24, 1844, the first electronic telegraphic message was sent from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland. Samuel Morse sent the message, "What hath God wrote?" It revolutionized long-distance communication. The history that I've shared with you is important to me and my work. But I've just looked at the United States and the Western world. Things were, of course, happening in the rest of the world, too. In 1877, antiseptic was used for the first time in hospitals. In Scotland, the surgeon Joseph Lister began cleaning wounds and surgical equipment with carbolic acid. He insisted that his surgical team clean their hands with this carbolic acid prior to surgery. Now, about 10 blocks from where I live, there is a new building that brings a sanitized operating room to the patient. In 1826, in Chalon-sur-Saône, this photograph was made, and it's the first known photograph. Before this, the world had no photography, no cinema, no television, no computer screen. In the month of May, in 1844 in England, Henry Fox Talbot, a scientist, inventor, and photography pioneer, published The Pencil of Nature. Henry Fox Talbot had devised the first negative to positive photographic process. And for more than a century, it was the basis for making reproducible photographic images. The book that he published featured this image, titled The Open Door. But my then Western-educated mind had ignored the rest of the world. I thought back to the time when I was a teenager and knew everything. Perhaps Henry Fox Talbot's photographs, titled The Open Door, should have meant more to me. I should have known that important things were happening in the rest of the world too, like events in what we call the Middle East. Perhaps I should have known that in October of 1842, the first Afghan war with the British ended with an Afghan victory. Perhaps I should have known that in the mid-19th century, these words were written. No sooner is this resplendent word uttered than its animating energies, stirring within all created things, give birth to the means and instruments whereby such arts can be produced and perfected. Photography was a radical new use of both organic and inorganic matter. It was using an old instrument called the camera obscura in a new way. Science was used to make materials changed by reflected light visible. A new medium of art was introduced to the world. It was a new medium of art that could be used to create metaphors. As I went to museums and galleries and looked at photographs and printed publications, I began to realize that a photograph is not the thing photographed. A photograph is a thing in itself. I began to realize that a photograph is a metaphor that could, well, back to Tolstoy, be a method of joining them together in the same feeling that is indispensable for life and progress toward well-being of individuals and of humanity. Do you remember this slide? In May of 1844, communication was transformed. In May of 1844, the telegraph transformed what we could read. In May of 1844, the photograph transformed what we could see. Two means of sharing information globally were shared to the world. In 1967, I was beginning to learn that it was important to recognize that things change. In 1967, Independence Mall looked like this. It was then that I learned that in 1844, there was a spiritual revolution that began in Persia, now Iran. As a then new husband and future father, that spiritual movement would become an important part of my life. It would also direct my then desired career as a photographer. In 1967, I learned that during the evening of May 22nd, 1844, the world's newest global religion began. I learned that this spiritual revolution was to usher in a new era destined to begin the establishment of the unity of humanity. It was a spiritual revolution to obliterate the cause of divisions among people, races, and nations. The first words that I found that related to the principles of the spiritual revolution were, first is the independent investigation of truth. For blind imitation of the past will stunt the mind. As a young artist, I almost immediately searched for those writings for words about art. Being the youngest in a family of artists, I had always heard discussions about the responsibilities of art. It is more than something beautiful. It's more than something pretty. For me, beauty is a visual tool, an artistic tool that is used to create metaphors of truth. I can also share with you that as a young artist, I was certainly trying to avoid imitating the past. I understood that a photograph was a thing in itself, but I didn't understand how to make it mine. In 1965, I was in the Air Force, and I was stationed in France. Being stationed in France was very important to me as an artist, and it would become more important to me as a person. It was there that I met and married the lady who would love me and build a family with me. As an artist, I learned to accept that I am an artist. And it's not always easy to accept that or to understand that. I knew that there had been a century-long question about photography being an art or not. I knew that the issue of time was both a technical issue as well as a content issue. And it's important to know when the shutter is open. I know that I wanted to make photographs that would, well, back to Tolstoy again, join our human family together in the same feeling. Let's backtrack a bit, because I was very lucky while stationed in France. While on one of my many trips to Paris, I met and had a short conversation with the young Ornette Coleman. In our short conversation, I asked him how he developed his sound. I mean, Ornette Coleman played a plastic saxophone. His answer was very simple and very complex. He said, "Do you." But I didn't know me. I spent the next 20 years trying to find me. In 1972, I left the Air Force to accept a job offer at the Evening and Sunday Bulletin in Philadelphia. I became the first black photographer to work for a major daily newspaper in the city of Philadelphia, and I became the fourth black photographer to work for a major daily newspaper in the United States. The civil rights movement of the 1960s had opened many new doors for black people, and those of us who went through those doors now had the opportunity and the responsibility to keep those doors open for others. I resigned in 1981. A year before I resigned, I returned to my hometown in Farrell, Pennsylvania, that little steel town in western Pennsylvania. I returned to create a small body of work that consisted of 19 prints. The title was On the Hill, and I returned to see if I could find me. The town of Farrell is a small steel mill town on the Ohio border. And all of my memories of my family and my youth are there. The town was on the side of a hill, a steep hill. And I remember seeing the steel mill workers struggling up that hill from the mill that was at the bottom of that hill. Those cars remind me of those workers. And the field, I remembered those long hours of playing with my friends in that grass. Dancing, even though these were very technically fine prints, they didn't feel like me. They were very classical in feeling. They felt like love letters written by someone else. I wanted blues. I wanted field hollers. Farrell High School, 1955. In 1955, I learned of the murder and lynching of Emmett Till. He was 14, I was 15. He was 1 year and 2 days younger than me. I saw the photograph of his mutilated body in the Jet magazine that was sold in my father's barbershop. I was working in my father's barbershop and I sold that magazine. I heard the arguments about the lynching. Some of those men sitting in the barber chair said, "The boy should have known better." Some of those men sitting in the barber's chair, many of them World War II veterans, said, "Enough is enough." As much as I liked those photographic images, I was sharing what I saw, but I wasn't sharing what I felt. I know that this water tank is on the top of the hill. I know that the morning sun rose over that water tank. I grew up knowing that I wanted to go beyond that water tank. Even though this is my first photograph collected by an art museum, it didn't feel like me. With that sale, I proved to myself, though, that I could take a photograph and make a photographic print. But everything was happening in front of the camera. I was taking a picture, and everything was formula after that. Going to my darkroom, following formulas, eliminating printing mistakes, and working toward a predetermined idea, a definition of what a good print should and would look like. Back to Tolstoy. I wasn't joining them in the same feeling. Anyone who looked at those photographs might know what I'd seen, but they would not know what I felt. So somewhere along the line, I thought, what if? What if I allowed what was considered printing mistakes to be used to change the way a photographic print felt? What if I wanted to share with you my feeling of sunlight coming in a window in the early morning? What if I used a photograph that resembled a window rather than an actual window? What if I reshaped and stained the edges of the print with a bleach that's used in the photographic process to chemically lighten an area? What if I removed the content of the lighted area with that bleach and let the stain that overuse of that bleach creates? What if using those mistakes of photochemistry allowed me to create an image that looked like what I felt? In 1982, at the age of 42, I decided to go to college. I had spent 9 years working at a city newspaper as a photojournalist. But I had no college degree, and I still didn't know who I was. I didn't know how to do me. I spent the next 6 years earning my master's degree in fine art. In 1988, I was invited to attend a gathering of black men in South Carolina. We were 16 black men. We were all Baha'is from around the country. It was the second gathering of something called the Black Men's Gathering. In America, black men gathering has historically been perceived as threatening. Black men assembling for whatever reason often suffered negative and historically dangerous repercussions. But we gathered and we spoke with each other and we looked into each other's eyes. We laughed with each other and we prayed and sang with each other. It was a week that changed me. I had begun to find me. I was still in art school, and art school was wonderful since I not only had the opportunity to seriously play, but play and experimentation was required. I began to realize that since my childhood, I had been searching newspapers and magazines looking for what newspaper folk call headshots. I had been looking for positive images of men who look like me. Magazines, newspapers, and even museums were empty of positive images of black men. I called those empty spaces photographs by omission. I had learned while working in the newspaper the power of the photographic image. And I'm sure that most, if not all, of the men in that gathering of black men knew this image of Emmett Till. Mr. Nathan Rutstein, a Baha'i and author of Healing Racism in America, A Prescription for the Disease, wrote, "We, adults and children alike, often revert to distasteful traits when we feel threatened, a fight or flight mechanism." Now, when I was 15, I had gone to sleep. That photograph of Emmett Till had caused me to take flight. I had gone from being a straight A student to failing and often causing trouble. I was 1 year and 2 days older than Emmett Till. I knew that it could have happened to me. After all, it happened to him and many more black boys and men. In the writings of the Baha'i Faith, I found this. The pages of swiftly appearing newspapers are indeed the mirror of the world. They reflect the deeds and the pursuits of diverse people and kindreds. They both reflect them and make them known. They are mirrors endowed with hearing, sight, and speech. Baha'u'llah had used a mirror as a metaphor. Perhaps I could use a mirror to create a piece of art using the metaphors that he gave us. In the newspaper library, I found the tear sheet of the headshot of Paul Robeson. It was stamped and dated on his face with publishing and death dates. The words of Baha'u'llah helped me to make a piece of art that used stop time and real time as part of the form and as part of the content. This piece is printed on glass mirror using a product called liquid light. It's sealed with a coat of acrylic floor finish and placed while wet in the sun. The sun reflected in the mirror, and it boils and distresses the surface of the image. You can see self, real time, between the stop time pattern of dots of the newspaper print. The words, thus have their superstitions become veiled between them and their own hearts, and kept them from the path of God. Those words helped me to make Emmett Till America, 1955. As human beings, superstitions had become veiled between us and our own hearts. Some things in my art are part of a conversation. Some things in my art are gifts. And I was beginning to find me. After making hundreds of headshots in the newspaper, after, as a child, searching for photographs that looked like me, after understanding what the photograph of Emmett Till did to my life, I was beginning to find my subject. I was beginning to find the content for my art, the human face. After all, the early Egyptians had made Fayum portraits to accompany their dead to burial. The early Christians had painted their saints and martyrs in the catacombs of Rome. And as a child, I was finding the cultural filters associated with the newspaper headshot of African American men disturbing. I had searched through newspapers, magazines, and later museums for positive images of myself, but found almost none. We were most often published as comic relief and criminal association. The entire black community was imaged by what might be defined as photographic omission. I simply wanted to do a body of art grounded on the faces of African American men that would introduce more diverse and honest images of our human identity. Know ye not why we created you all from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your heart how ye were created. The words, we created you all from the same dust, challenged me. I decided to see if I could use dust instead of the standard photographic material of gelatin and silver. Silver in my mind had become a metaphor of material wealth. But dust, I thought, what if? The materials that I chose to work with could in themselves be metaphors. Earth pigment and casein are simply dust and milk. The milk, casein. I knew that protein could chemically be made light sensitive. The pigment or dust that I use is mined in the southwestern region of France, near the Lascaux cave paintings. And it's probably the same dust that our human ancestors used over 15,000 years ago to make those cave images. The combination of earth pigments and casein was used in cave paintings in China more than 10,000 years ago. So my materials are not new. The use of pigment and casein is in fact ancient. In 1993, I started making dust-shaped hearts. The first of my siblings had a terminal illness. He was dying. For a record of who we were, I did headshots of my brothers, and I decided to do a suite of work called Sons of My Father. I'd set a few rules in place from my newspaper experience. The face of each person is photographed within 15 minutes, preferably 5. Eyes direct front, eyes into the camera, lips together. Mr. Ira Camp Jr., brother who taught me to dance. Making each print is 2 distinct processes: photographing the content, or the face, of course, and printing the photographed content. The face being photographed within this set of rules became the constant. That established constant allowed flexibility in printing. The print of each face requires its own solution. So each and every print has its own identity. Dr. Hubert Camp, brother who taught me nobility. Mr. Herbert Camp, brother who taught me to see. Mr. James Camp, brother who taught me to ride a bicycle. I regret not creating an image of my sister, Sylvia, who in 1946 became a registered nurse. She was also a fine watercolorist who was recognized with a fellowship from the state of Colorado. In 1966, she took her children to live in France on the Côte d'Azur. Her children shared family stories of how she would meet them at school on the last day of school, and the car would be loaded with camping equipment. They were to spend their summer traveling Europe being educated. Now, as an artist, I think I make good mistakes and I make bad mistakes. The good mistakes become those gifts that are part of the conversation of creating work. But bad mistakes are those things that I should have done but didn't do. My sister became a photograph by omission. I regret that. In 1995, I was honored with fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts for Photography. I also received the Pew Fellowship for the Arts and for works on paper. I also received the Pew Fellowship for the Arts for works on paper. Those fellowships allow me to continue work on my Dust-Shaped Hearts project. The Pew Fellowship for work on paper was special because recognition for works on paper encouraged me to continue exploring the materials that I had chosen to work with: milk, dust, and paper. The title of my body of work, Dust-Shaped Hearts, was influenced by the poet Robert Hayden. In 1940, he published the book of poetry, Heart Shape in the Dust. Mr. Robert Hayden was an African-American poet, essayist, and educator. He served as U.S. Poet Laureate from 1976 to 1978, and he was the first African-American writer to hold that office. Mr. Hayden was also a Baha'i. The men that I met in South Carolina at that gathering, a black Baha'i men, became the second suite of prints in Dust-Shaped Hearts. The suite was titled Men Who Pray. Man Who Prays, Mr. Moses Richardson. Man Who Prays, Dr. William Roberts. Man Who Prays, Mr. John Lewis Morris. That suite was completed with 19 faces. and I continued photographing other men who could be considered endangered in America. But there were also men that I admired. They were like angels to me. Men like Mr. Robert Big Oak, Earth and Stone. Making art is, for me, a conversation. The material or form of earth pigment, casein, paper, and water get together and we talk. We consult. We talk about the content, the face, and we work together to decide what it means. What is the metaphor? The result of that conversation becomes a dust-shaped heart. A few decades earlier, I had started this body of work in self-defense. After several lectures and women asking me, why don't you do women? Regretting that I had omitted my sister, I started to create women, dust-shaped hearts. Woman Who Writes, Miss Lorraine Carey. Miss Leah Chase, chef. The suite of work done in New Orleans post-Katrina has mud, soil, dust from the Ninth Parish. I never intended to do public figures, but the author of Cheney'sville Incident, Mr. David Bradley, and I shared the experience of Western Pennsylvania steel towns. Judge A. Leon Higginbottom, Jr. had influenced the way our legal system thinks and acts about race in America. Congressman John Lewis, good trouble, he had known about Emmett Till too. Mr. Jacob Gassenberger, Silver Cowboy. Mr. Jacob Gassenberger was a street performer. My conversation with him in New Orleans after the Katrina hurricane reminded me of lessons I'd learned as a child during this Sunday dinner conversations, that we all live in the same world. Mr. Mohajiri shared words with me that changed my life. Know ye not why we created you all from the same dust? That no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your heart how you were created. Using the simple materials of earth, milk, and paper, I try to share a story that encourages viewers to explore the dignity and nobility that can be found in our human family. Langston Hughes wrote in a poem, Notes on a Commercial Theater. He wrote of theater works that had been appropriated from theaters during the Harlem Renaissance and presented in Broadway theater. He wrote, but someday somebody will stand up and talk about me and write about me, black and beautiful, and sing about me and put on plays about me. I reckon it'll be me, myself. The social critic and author Frantz Fanon wrote in Black Skin, White Mask, why not the quite simple attempt to touch the other, to feel the other, to explain the other to myself? Thank you so much for allowing me to share me with you. Perhaps someday I will see your art, or perhaps we will meet and we can sit and chat, and you will share you with me. Thank you very, very much.